Peace and blessings, everybody. It's September the 21st at 12:30 a.m. I'm reading this book, Blind Injustice. A former prosecutor exposes the psychology and politics of wrongful convictions by Mark Godsey. And this was such a powerful letter written by a prosecutor who actually located his soul. So I thought it's worth reading into YouTube. It's such a powerful letter written by an actual prosecutor. It starts on page 54. So the actual author is also a prosecutor, but he's going to give an introduction to the letter. It starts off, I close this chapter with excerpts of a letter written by a former prosecutor, Marty Stroud. When Stroud was a young man, he prosecuted Glenn Ford for murder and sent him to death row. Ford spent 30 years on death row in Louisiana before being fully exonerated in 2014. Immediately after he was exonerated and released, Ford took ill with cancer, and he died not long after in 2015. During his short period of freedom before his death, the state of Louisiana fought Ford's claim for compensation, ultimately prevailing and keeping Ford from receiving a dime. While Ford was still alive, the editorial board of the Shreveport Times published an editorial urging Louisiana to compensate him. In response, Stroud sent the following letter to the newspaper. And I'm going to read you the letter that the prosecutor sent to the newspaper. This is the first and probably will be the last time that I have publicly voiced an opinion on any of your editorials. Quite frankly, I believe many of your editorials avoid the hard question on a current issue in order not to be too controversial. I congratulate you here, though, because you have taken a clear stand on what needs to be done in the name of justice. Glenn Ford should be completely compensated to every extent possible because of the flaws of a system that effectively destroyed his life. The audacity of the state's effort to deny Mr. Ford any compensation for the horrors he suffered in the name of Louisiana justice is appalling. I know of what I speak. I was at the trial of Glenn Ford from the beginning to the end. I witnessed the imposition of the death sentence upon him. I believed that justice was done. I had done my job. I was one of the prosecutors, and I was proud of what I had done. Members of the victim's family profusely thanked the prosecutors and investigators for our efforts. They had received some closure, or so everyone thought. However, due to the hard work and dedication of lawyers working with the Capital Post-Conviction Project of Louisiana, along with the efforts of the Caddo Parish District Attorneys and Sheriff's offices, the truth was uncovered. Glenn Ford was an innocent man. He was released from the hellhole he endured for the last 3 decades. There was no technicality here. Crafty lawyering did not secure the release of a criminal. Mr. Ford spent 30 years of his life in a small, dingy cell. His surroundings were dire. Lighting was poor. Heating and cooling were almost non-existent. Food bordered on the uneatable. Nobody wanted to be accused of coddling a death row inmate. But Mr. Ford never gave up. He continued the fight for his innocence, and it finally paid off. And yet, despite the grave injustice, the state does not accept any responsibility for the damage suffered by one of its citizens. The bureaucratic response appears to be that nobody did anything intentionally wrong. Thus, the state has no responsibility. This is nonsensical. Explain that position to Mr. Ford and his family. Facts are stubborn things. They do not go away. At the time this case was tried, there was evidence that would have cleared Glenn Ford. The easy and convenient argument is that the prosecutors did not know of such evidence. Thus, they were absolved of any responsibility for the wrongful conviction. I can take no comfort in such an argument. As a prosecutor and officer of the court, I had the duty to prosecute fairly. While I could properly strike hard blows, ethically I could not strike foul ones. Part of my duty was to disclose promptly any exculpatory evidence relating to trial and penalty issues of which I was made aware. My fault was that I was too passive. I did not consider the rumors about the involvement of parties other than Mr. Ford to be credible, especially since the 3 others who were indicted for the crime were ultimately released for lack of sufficient evidence to proceed to the trial. Had I been more inquisitive, perhaps the evidence would have come to light years ago, but I was not, and my inaction contributed to the miscarriage of justice in this matter. Based on what we had, I was confident that the right man was being prosecuted, and I was not going to commit resources to investigate what I considered to be a bogus claims that we had the wrong man. My mindset was wrong and blinded me to the purpose of seeking justice rather than obtaining a conviction of a person who I believed to be guilty. I did not hide evidence. I simply did not seriously consider that sufficient information may have been out there that could have led to a different conclusion, and that omission is on me. Furthermore, my silence at trial undoubtedly contributed to the wrong-headed result. I did not question the unfairness of Mr. Ford having appointed counsel who had never tried a criminal jury case, much less a capital one. It never concerned me that the defense had insufficient funds to hire experts, or that the defense counsel shut down their firms for substantial periods of time to prepare for trial. These attorneys tried their very best, but they were in the wrong arena. They were excellent attorneys with experience in civil matters, but this did not prepare them for trying to save the life of Mr. Ford. The jury was all white. Mr. Ford was an African American. Potential African American jurors were struck with little thought about potential discrimination because at that time, a claim of racial discrimination in the selection of jurors could not be successful unless it could be shown that the office had engaged in a pattern of such conduct in other cases. As I knew this was a very burdensome requirement that had never been met in the jurisprudence of which I was aware. I also participated in placing before the jury dubious testimony from a forensic pathologist that the shooter had to be left-handed, even though there was no eyewitness to the murder, and yes, Glenn Ford was left-handed. All too late, I learned that the testimony was pure junk science, as at its worst. In 1984, I was 33 years old. I was arrogant, judgmental, narcissistic, and very full of myself. I was not as interested in justice as I was in winning. To borrow a phrase from Al Pacino in the movie, and justice for all, winning became everything. After the death verdict in the Ford trial, I went out with others and celebrated with a few rounds of drinks. That's sick. I had been entrusted with the duty to seek the death of a fellow human being, a very solemn task that certainly did not warrant any celebration. In my rebuttal argument during the penalty phase of the trial, I mocked In my rebuttal argument during the penalty phase of the trial, I mocked Mr. Ford, stating that this man wanted to stay alive so he could be given the opportunity to prove his innocence. I continued by saying this should be an affront to each of you jurors, for he showed no remorse, only contempt for your verdict. How totally wrong was I? I speak only for me and no one else. I apologize to Glenn Ford for all the misery I have caused him and his family. I apologize to the family of Mr. Roseman. All right, get it together. I apologize to the family of Mr. Roseman, the victim, for giving them the false hope of some closure. I apologize to the members of the jury for not having all of the story that should have been disclosed to them. I apologize to the court in not having been more diligent in my duty to ensure that proper disclosures of any exculpatory evidence had been provided to the defense. Glenn Ford deserves every penny owed to him under the compensation statute. I now realize all too painfully that as a young 33-year-old prosecutor, I was not capable of making a decision that could have led to the killing of another human being. No one should be given the ability to impose a sentence of death in any criminal proceeding. We are simply incapable of devising a system that can fairly and impartially impose a sentence of death because we are all fallible human beings. I end with the hope that Providence will have more mercy for me than I showed Glenn Ford. But I am also sobered by the realization that I certainly am not deserving of it. The author of the book, Mark Godsey, goes on to write more about that letter and the actual prosecutor who wrote the letter. I think it's such an incredible letter that a prosecutor would find and locate his soul and put his soul in writing, that I had to read that into YouTube. Do you think that other prosecutors will be able to find and locate their soul? I pray that they do.
I hope so too.